My husband cheated on me, and after we divorced, he got into a car accident and ran over our daughter, her, while his new wife covered it up. I should have known better. After 15 years of marriage, you'd think I'd recognize the signs. But nothing prepared me for that day. The day Jason proved, without a doubt, where I really stood in his life. It started that morning. I was in the kitchen, reaching up to grab a glass from the top shelf, when a sharp pull shot through my wrist. I gasped, lost my grip, and the glass slipped from my fingers, shattering on the counter. A searing pain radiated up my arm, and I instinctively clutched my wrist, feeling a dull, growing throb. Jason was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone. "What happened?" he asked, not even looking up. "I think I hurt my wrist," I said, wincing. "It really hurts," he sighed, still staring at his phone. "Just put some ice on it. You'll be fine." I stared at him. "Jason, I'm serious. I can't even move my fingers properly." Finally, he glanced over, his expression more annoyed than concerned. "It's probably just a sprain. Why make a big deal out of it?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Can you take me to the hospital? It's probably nothing, but I want to make sure." He let out a loud exhale, setting his phone down as if I had just asked him to move a mountain. "Fine, but we're not going to be there all day, okay?" I ignored the irritation in his voice. I wasn't in the mood to argue. I just needed to get my wrist checked out. The drive should have been simple. 5 minutes, maybe less. But Jason was already on edge, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel like I had completely ruined his day. Then his phone rang. I glanced at the screen. Laura. My stomach twisted. His ex. The woman who, despite being out of the picture for years, still lingered like a shadow over our marriage. Jason immediately picked up. "Hey." His tone softened, the irritation from earlier vanishing in an instant. I looked out the window, pretending I wasn't listening. "What? Now?" he asked. He paused, exhaled, and then said, yeah, I guess I can. Just give me a sec." He pulled the car over. I frowned. "What are you doing?" He covered the mouthpiece of his phone and looked at me with pure impatience. "Sarah, get out." I blinked. "What?" "I have urgent business to take care of." I stared at him, my injured wrist throbbing. "Jason, we're literally 2 minutes from the hospital." He rolled his eyes. "Come on, don't be dramatic. You can walk." I felt my throat tighten. "Jason, my wrist." "You'll be fine." He cut me off. "Stop acting like it's the end of the world." I looked at him in disbelief. "Are you seriously kicking me out of the car? Right now?" He sighed loudly, gripping the steering wheel. "Sarah, get out of the damn car. Laura needs me." I let out a hollow laugh. "Laura needs you?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me like I was in his way. For a moment, I thought about refusing, about sitting there, forcing him to do the bare minimum as my husband. But then I realized something. I was begging a man to care, and that was the most humiliating part of all. I opened the door, stepped out, and slammed it shut. He didn't say a word, just drove off, leaving me standing there on the side of the road with my wrist burning and my heart pounding. The sun was relentless. The hospital wasn't far, but the heat made every step feel like a mile. My wrist ached, sweat dripped down my back, and the humiliation burned more than anything. I walked. For 30 excruciating minutes, I walked. By the time I got to the emergency room, my shirt was sticking to me, my legs were trembling, and I felt lightheaded from the heat. The nurse at the desk took one look at me and frowned. "Are you all right?" I forced a smile. "I think I sprained my wrist." She nodded and handed me a clipboard. "Fill this out, and we'll get you in as soon as we can." I sat down, the cold plastic chair pressing against my sweat-damp skin. I flexed my fingers slightly, wincing at the sharp pain that shot through my wrist. And then I pulled out my phone. No messages. No missed calls. Jason had dropped me off like garbage on the side of the road and hadn't even bothered to check if I made it. I shouldn't have been surprised. But somehow, it still hurt. I sat in that stiff plastic chair in the hospital waiting room, staring at my phone. No messages. No missed calls. Not from Jason. Not from anyone. The ache in my wrist was nothing compared to the dull, heavy weight settling in my chest. The doctor finally called me in. A nurse helped me onto the examination table, and I sat there while they pressed and prodded at my wrist, making me wince with every small movement. After an x-ray and some cold antiseptic wipes that stung as they cleaned my sweat-damp skin, the doctor finally came in with the results. "It's a hairline fracture," he said. "Not too severe, but you'll need a brace. Try not to put any pressure on it for a few weeks." I nodded, barely hearing him. I was still replaying the moment in the car. The way Jason hadn't even hesitated to throw me out like I was an inconvenience. As the nurse wrapped my wrist, my phone buzzed. My heart leaped for a second. Maybe Jason had finally realized what he'd done. Maybe he was calling to check on me. But when I looked at the screen, it wasn't him. It was Melanie. I hesitated before answering. My stepdaughter and I were close, closer than she'd ever been with her biological mother, but she wasn't someone who usually called out of the blue. Sarah? Her voice was sharp, worried. What the hell happened? I swallowed. Did Jason tell you? No. Bethany did. She saw you walking to the hospital. Bethany was our neighbor, an older woman who never missed a thing that happened on our street. Of course, she would have noticed me limping down the sidewalk in the heat. Are you okay? Melanie asked. What happened to your wrist? I exhaled slowly. I heard it this morning. Jason was supposed to take me to the hospital, but something else came up. Silence. Then, something else? Her voice had a dangerous edge. You mean someone else? I didn't respond, and that was enough of an answer. Where are you now? She asked. I'm still at the hospital. Stay there. I'm coming to get you. I started to protest, but she had already hung up. Less than 15 minutes later, Melanie stormed into the hospital waiting room like a hurricane. Her dark hair was pulled into a high ponytail, and her eyes, so much like her father's but without the same coldness, scanned the room until she found me. Her face softened when she saw my wrist wrapped in a brace. Jesus, Sarah. Before I could even respond, she bent down and hugged me tightly, careful not to jostle my arm. I can't believe him, she whispered. I can't believe he actually did that. I gave a small, bitter laugh. Believe it. Melanie pulled back, fire in her eyes. Come on, let's get you home. I let her help me to my feet, feeling exhausted despite not having done anything but sit and wait for hours. The drive back was quiet for the first few minutes. I could tell she was trying to keep her emotions in check, but then she let out a sharp breath and gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. He left you on the side of the road, Sarah, she said. For Laura. I stared at my lap. I know. He didn't even come back for you? No. She made a sound of disgust. You've given that man everything, and he treats you like you're disposable. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I don't know what to do. Melanie was silent for a moment. Then she said, I do. I glanced at her. What do you mean? She hesitated, gripping the wheel. There's something I need to tell you. I waited. You know my great-uncle, the one I was close to? I nodded. Uncle Raymond. He was her mother's uncle technically, but Melanie had always been closer to him than anyone in her biological family. He left me something in his will. A lot, actually. She hesitated, then glanced at me. Over $700,000. I almost choked. What? She nodded. Yeah. It's been tied up in probate, but I should be getting it soon. I didn't know what to say. I had no idea he had left her anything, let alone that kind of money. I was planning to split it, she admitted. Give some to you, some to Dad. But after this? No way in hell. I stared at her. Melanie, that's your money. She shook her head. No, you're my family, not him. He doesn't deserve a dime after what he did today. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. My throat was tight. My chest felt heavy, and all I could think about was how Jason had left me. How Melanie had come for me instead. You're not alone, Sarah, she said quietly. You're not stuck with him. Something inside me cracked. I didn't cry, but I felt like I could. Instead, I just reached over and squeezed her hand, my fingers curling around hers. Thank you, I whispered. She gave a small, sad smile. Don't thank me. Just promise me that you won't let him keep treating you like this. I didn't respond right away, because, for the first time, I realized that maybe I did have a choice. Maybe I didn't have to keep waiting for Jason to change. Maybe I could walk away. I spent the next few days in a fog, my wrist aching but my thoughts circling around something much worse than physical pain. Jason barely spoke to me. He'd come home late, muttering about work and meetings, and disappear into his office. But I knew. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was overthinking everything because I was still raw from what happened at the hospital. But then the pattern started. Jason was suddenly busy every evening. He left the house at odd hours, claiming it was urgent. And the worst part? He smelled different. I'd noticed it the night after Melanie took me home from the hospital. He got into bed beside me, and I caught a faint whiff of women's perfume. Not mine. Something floral, expensive. I didn't say anything at first, But I started watching him, and I noticed everything. He started going to Laura's house 3, sometimes 4 times a week. At first, he lied. He said he was at client dinners or late meetings, but one evening, when he left, I followed him. I didn't even care how desperate it made me look. I just needed the truth. I stayed back, driving slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. He didn't go to a restaurant or his office. He went straight to Laura's house. He parked in her driveway like he'd done it 100 times before, walked up to the door like he belonged there. And when she answered, she was in a silk robe. I drove away before I could throw up. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling like the world was closing in. Every single lie he had told me suddenly fit together like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to see before. The next morning, I couldn't hold it in anymore. He was in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee like he wasn't actively destroying our marriage, when I finally spoke. "You've been seeing her." Jason didn't even flinch. He just took a sip of his coffee and turned to me with that bored expression he always had when I was overreacting. "What are you talking about?" I gritted my teeth. "I followed you, Jason. I saw you. You were at her house last night." Again. His jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second. Then he set his coffee down with a sigh. "I told you before, Sarah. It's business." I laughed. A sharp, bitter sound. "Business?" She answered the door in a robe. He rolled his eyes. She was getting ready for bed. "Jesus, Sarah, you really think I'm sleeping with her?" I didn't answer. Because yes, I did. He ran a hand through his hair. "You're unbelievable. You always assume the worst of me." "The worst?" I took a step forward, my injured wrist pulsing in its brace. "You left me on the side of the road for her, Jason." My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "You didn't even check if I got to the hospital. You didn't even text me." His expression darkened. "You're being dramatic." "Dramatic?" My voice rose. "You've been sneaking around, lying to my face, and now you're calling me dramatic?" He exhaled sharply. "But then, the final blow. You're just mad because Melanie is giving you that money." It was like a slap in the face. I stared at him. "Excuse me?" His lips curled in disgust. "Don't act innocent. You've been filling her head with nonsense about me, haven't you? Manipulating her." I scoffed. "Melanie made that decision on her own. Because she saw what you did to me." He laughed. "But it wasn't real. It was cruel. You're pathetic," he spat. "You're poisoning my own daughter against me. And for what? A damn inheritance?" My hands shook. "That's what you think this is about?" "Oh, please," he sneered. "You're not some victim, Sarah. You've been waiting for an opportunity to turn her against me, and now you've finally got one. You're disgusting." My chest tightened. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jason stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. "You want to act like the perfect little wife? Like the innocent, loyal victim?" His eyes were cold. "You're just a gold-digging bitch." Something inside me snapped. Before I could even think, I grabbed the nearest thing, his coffee mug, and threw it at the wall. It shattered, pieces flying in every direction. Jason didn't even flinch. I was breathing hard, my whole body shaking. "Get out," he smirked. That smug, arrogant smirk. Gladly, he grabbed his keys and stormed out the door. I waited for him to come back, but he didn't. Not that night. Not the next. Not for almost 2 weeks. Jason didn't come back. Not that night. Not the next. Days turned into a week, and then almost 2. At first, I told myself I didn't care, that this was what I wanted. But the truth? I did care. Not because I missed him, but because I couldn't shake the guilt. I kept replaying the fight in my head. The look in his eyes when I told him to leave. The way he smirked, like he had won, even as he walked out. And every time I let my guard down, that nagging voice whispered in the back of my head. What if you overreacted? What if he was telling the truth? I hated that voice. Melanie stayed with me as much as she could. She had her own place, but she made it a point to come by every night, just to make sure I wasn't sitting alone, spiraling. She brought food, stayed late, watched terrible reality TV with me. But even then, I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. One night, after she had insisted on ordering pizza, she finally said it. "You're doing the right thing, you know." I looked up from my barely touched plate. "What?" She leaned back against the couch. "Kicking him out. Standing up for yourself." I let out a breath. "Then why do I feel so awful?" Melanie sighed. "Because you're a good person." She nudged my knee with her foot. "But don't let that guilt make you forget what he did to you." I rubbed my temples. I don't understand." If he really wanted to fix things, wouldn't he have come back by now? She gave me a look. Sarah. He's with Laura. I flinched. Even though I knew, hearing it out loud still felt like a slap. And then, something clicked. I sat up, gripping the edge of the couch. Mel, does she even talk to you? Melanie frowned. Who? Your mother. The words tasted strange in my mouth. Laura. She blinked. No. I stared at her. What do you mean, no? I mean, no. She doesn't call. She doesn't text. She shrugged like it didn't matter, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She never really cared. A cold realization settled over me. So all that time Jason said he was helping her reconnect with you. Bullshit. Melanie finished. We sat in silence, the weight of that truth filling the space between us. Jason had used his own daughter as an excuse to sneak around. Melanie let out a bitter laugh. You know the last time she actually reached out to me? 6 months ago. She sent some vague message about meeting up for lunch. I ignored it, and she never followed up. My stomach churned. And Jason knew that? She scoffed. Of course he did. I closed my eyes. That was it. The last shred of doubt, gone. The final nail in the coffin. I couldn't keep doing this. I wouldn't. The decision hit me all at once, like a switch flipping in my mind. I wasn't going to be the woman who let her husband treat her like an afterthought. I wasn't going to let guilt keep me shackled to a man who had thrown me away without hesitation. I'm filing for divorce, I said. Melanie's head snapped toward me. Are you sure? I nodded. Yeah, I'm sure. For the first time in weeks, I felt light. The next morning, I called a lawyer. His name was Daniel Harper, and he came highly recommended by one of Melanie's friends who had gone through a brutal divorce. He sounded calm, professional, but sharp. I specialize in cases like yours, he said. Women leaving long-term marriages where there's financial and emotional manipulation involved. I hadn't even told him the full story yet, but somehow, he already understood. I'll need some details, he said. Everything from finances to property ownership. Do you have access to your accounts? I hesitated. Jason handles most of the money. He sighed. That's what I thought. You'll need to start gathering records. Bank statements, tax filings, anything you can access. I swallowed. Okay. And Sarah? Yeah. His voice softened. Don't talk to him about this yet. Not until we're ready. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Understood. But as soon as I hung up, I grabbed my phone. And I texted Jason. I'm filing for divorce. You should talk to a lawyer. Then I turned off my phone and took a deep breath. For the first time in years, I was taking back control. Jason didn't respond to my message. I waited for hours, then a full day, then 2. I checked my phone more times than I cared to admit, but there was nothing. Not a single text, not a call, not even an acknowledgement. I wasn't sure what I had expected. Anger? Begging? Some last-minute attempt to salvage things? But instead, Jason chose silence. Until Melanie got a call. She was at my house when it happened. We were sitting in the living room, drinking coffee, both pretending not to be waiting for his response. When her phone rang, she glanced at the screen and her face darkened. It's him, she muttered. My stomach twisted. Answer it. She put it on speaker. Melanie, Jason's voice came through, calm, casual, as if we weren't standing on the ruins of a 15-year marriage. I heard about your stepmother's little decision. Mother. I exhaled sharply through my nose, but I stayed quiet. Melanie's jaw clenched. Yeah. And? Jason sighed, like he was bored. Tell her I'll sign the papers. I blinked. That was it? No fight? No argument? Melanie frowned. You couldn't tell her yourself? I don't have anything to say to her. His words landed like a slap, but I refused to react. Melanie rolled her eyes. Fine. Anything else? A pause. Then, I'll come get my things in a few weeks. And then he hung up. I stared at the phone. That was it. That was how 15 years ended. Melanie turned to me. You okay? I forced a small smile. Yeah, but the truth? I didn't know what I felt. Relief? Anger? Maybe both. The weeks passed in a strange limbo. I focused on the divorce process, filing paperwork, gathering financial records, following Daniel's advice. I expected Jason to start trouble, to drag things out, to make it difficult. But instead, he did nothing. He didn't text, didn't call, didn't ask about the house, the finances, or even his own daughters. And then, one afternoon, 3 weeks after that phone call, I heard the sound of tires rolling into the driveway. Jason was here. Melanie had already warned her sisters, Emily and Chloe, so no one was surprised. But when I saw him step out of his car, something inside me shifted. He looked different, thinner. Not in a sick way, just stressed. His usual cocky posture was still there, but there was something else lurking beneath it. But what caught me off guard wasn't how he looked. It was the fact that he wasn't alone. A second car pulled in behind him, and Laura stepped out. I laughed. I couldn't help it. It was so predictable, so cliché. He was actually bringing her here, to our home. Melanie, standing beside me, made a disgusted noise. Are you serious? But we didn't have time to react because Jason had already started walking toward the house. He didn't greet me, didn't look at me. He just walked past, like I was invisible. He moved through the house with zero hesitation, heading straight to our bedroom, the one we used to share, without so much as a glance in my direction. Laura stayed outside, leaning against her car, smirking. Melanie clenched her fists. If she sets foot in this house, she won't, I said, and I meant it. I could hear Jason moving inside, opening drawers, shoving things into bags. He was ripping through our life together like it was nothing more than junk he needed to clear out. Emily and Chloe stood by the staircase, watching everything unfold, their faces tight with anger. They were only 17, but they weren't stupid. They had seen enough. Jason moved like a machine, cold, mechanical. He gathered only his belongings. No photos, no keepsakes. He didn't pause at the framed picture of our family in the hallway. He didn't glance at the notes Melanie used to leave in his office when she was a kid, little scribbles saying, "Love you, Dad." None of it mattered to him. And then, after nearly an hour of packing, he finally spoke. He stood by the front door, his bags at his feet, looking at his daughters for the first time since he arrived. "You'll understand one day," he said. His voice was calm, almost pitying. Melanie narrowed her eyes. "Understand what?" He sighed. "These are adult things. You're still young. One day, you'll see the bigger picture." Silence. Then Chloe, the quietest of the three, laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was sharp, bitter. Jason's brow furrowed. "What's funny?" Chloe shook her head. "Nothing. Just you, thinking we're all idiots." Jason's jaw tightened. "I never said that, but that's what you mean," Emily cut in. "You think we're too young to see that you're just a selfish asshole." His eyes darkened. "Watch your mouth." Emily smirked. "Or what? You gonna leave?" Jason's fists clenched. He wanted to argue, but he didn't, because he had already lost. He grabbed his bags and stormed outside, where Laura was waiting. He didn't say goodbye, didn't look back, and just like that, he was gone. The day I signed the final divorce papers, I expected to feel something. Relief, sadness, anger, anything. But as I sat in my lawyer's office, pen hovering over the last signature line, all I felt was calm. It was over. For months of negotiations, paperwork, and Jason dragging his feet, probably hoping I'd change my mind, or that I'd get tired of fighting and let him keep more than he deserved. But I didn't. Daniel, my lawyer, had been a shark. Every time Jason tried to guilt-trip me or twist the narrative, Daniel shut it down. "He wants the house," Daniel had told me one day, reading over Jason's latest ridiculous counteroffer. I'd laughed. Over my dead body. Jason had already gotten everything he wanted. His freedom, his new life with Laura. He wasn't getting my home, too. And in the end, he lost. I got the house. I got my fair share of the assets. I wasn't left begging for scraps, like I knew he had hoped. When I finished signing, Daniel gave me a small smile. "That's it, Sarah. You're officially free." I exhaled. Really free. Melanie was waiting for me outside the office. As soon as I stepped out, she pulled me into a hug. "It's done?" I nodded. She grinned. "So, how does it feel?" I thought about it for a moment. Then I smiled. Like I can finally breathe. At first, I thought the worst part of a divorce would be the loneliness. The silence of an empty house. The absence of someone always there, even if that someone had stopped truly seeing me years ago. But I was wrong. The worst part wasn't loneliness. It was unlearning the version of myself I had become with Jason. The Sarah who apologized for things that weren't her fault. The Sarah who felt guilty for wanting basic respect. The Sarah who shrank herself to avoid an argument. She had to go. I started seeing a therapist a few weeks after the papers were finalized. Melanie was the one who suggested it. "Just try it," she said. "You don't have to keep pretending you're fine all the time." And she was right. At first, I was skeptical. What could a stranger possibly tell me that I didn't already know? But Dr. Elaine Carter was different. She was in her early 50s, with sharp blue eyes and a no-nonsense way of speaking. The first time I sat in her office, she didn't ask me about Jason. She asked about me. What do you like to do, Sarah? I stared at her. What? She smiled. Your hobbies. What do you enjoy? I opened my mouth, closed it, because I didn't know. For years, my life had revolved around being Jason's wife, cooking what he liked, watching the shows he wanted, adjusting myself to whatever mood he was in that day. I had no idea what I liked anymore. That realization hit me harder than the divorce. Dr. Carter helped me rebuild myself, piece by piece. I started small. I tried painting. I was terrible at it, but I didn't care. I started jogging in the mornings, feeling the sun on my skin, the burn in my lungs. I stopped filtering myself in conversations, stopped holding my tongue when something bothered me. And little by little, I started to feel like me again. Jason and Laura officially started a business together a few months after the divorce. I wasn't surprised. I had always suspected their meetings were just an excuse to be together. And now, without the need to sneak around, they were public. I overheard things. Small-town gossip spread fast. People whispered about them at the grocery store, at the gym. Did you hear? Jason and Laura opened a real estate agency together. Oh, they were definitely together before the divorce. No way that just happened after. I didn't care. Not anymore. One day, I ran into Laura at a coffee shop. She spotted me first. She had that smug, victorious expression, like she had won, like Jason was some grand prize. But I just smiled, because she had no idea. Jason wasn't a prize. He was a burden. She could have him. The best part of life after divorce? My daughters. Emily and Chloe had moved into my house full-time. Even though they were 17 and had their own lives, they made it clear. They were staying with me. Melanie visited almost daily, bringing her sisters their favorite snacks, staying late to watch movies, filling the house with laughter and warmth. One night, we were sitting in the living room, watching some reality dating show. Melanie was curled up in the armchair. Emily and Chloe were sharing a blanket on the couch, and I was stretched out with my feet up. At one point, Chloe turned to me. You're different now, she said. I raised an eyebrow. Different how? She shrugged. Happier. Melanie nodded. You really are. I looked at them, at my daughters. The people who had stood by me when everything fell apart. The people who chose me over a man who never truly saw them. I smiled. I finally am. Everything should have been peaceful. The divorce was over, Jason was gone, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. But peace? It never lasts. It started small, little things that didn't seem important at first. Melanie became distant. Not in a way that was immediately obvious, but I noticed. She started spending more time away from the house. Her replies to my texts were shorter, and there was something in her eyes, something she wasn't saying. At first, I thought it was stress. The inheritance had changed things for her, and even though she had shared it with me, I knew that kind of money brought pressure. People expected things. Friends started treating her differently. And Jason? He had tried reaching out once, probably hoping to manipulate her into giving him a cut. She didn't fall for it. At least, that's what I thought. Then the real chaos began. One evening, Emily and Chloe were at the movies with friends, and Melanie had gone out again. I was home alone, drinking tea on the couch, when my phone rang. An unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. Sarah? A woman's voice. Shaky. I frowned. Yes? A deep breath. It's Bethany. Your neighbor. My stomach twisted. Bethany? What's wrong? You need to come outside. The way she said it. The way her voice cracked. I already knew. Before I even stood up, before I even opened the door, I knew something was wrong. I stepped onto the porch and saw the flashing red and blue lights. Police cars. An ambulance. Bethany was standing at the edge of my driveway, her arms wrapped around herself like she was holding something in. Her eyes met mine, and I saw it there. Grief. Sarah, she whispered. I barely heard her, because then I saw who they were covering with the white sheet. Chloe. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember running. All I remember was someone catching me before I hit the ground. Chloe was dead. The next few hours were a blur of questions and sobbing. The police said it was an accident. A car. Hit and run. She had been walking home with friends, but she had lagged behind. The car came out of nowhere. No witnesses saw the driver's face. The cameras on the street? Disabled. It didn't feel real. One moment, she was texting me about popcorn flavors, and the next, she was gone. I barely registered Melanie arriving at the hospital. Her face pale as she demanded answers from the doctors, from the police, from anyone who would listen. But there were no answers. Only silence. And then came the funeral. It was a cold, gray morning. The kind that felt hollow, empty. People came. Friends, family, teachers. Jason showed up, standing at the back like a ghost. He didn't speak. Didn't look at me. I didn't care. Melanie stood beside me, holding my hand so tightly I could feel her nails digging into my skin. I barely heard the speeches. I barely felt the cold wind biting at my skin. It all blurred together into one long nightmare. And then it was over. People left. The graveyard emptied. But I stayed. Melanie knelt beside me. Mom. I didn't respond. She squeezed my arm. Let's go home. I looked at her. And for the first time in weeks, I saw it. Guilt. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The way Melanie had changed. The way her hands shook when she thought I wasn't looking. The way she wouldn't meet my eyes. Something was wrong. And I was going to find out what. I started digging. I went through Chloe's texts, her last calls. I traced her steps that night. I talked to her friends. And then I found it. A voicemail. One Chloe had never had the chance to send. I hit play. At first, static. Then, her voice. Shaky. Panicked. Melanie, please, just call me back. I don't know what's going on, but I saw you. I saw you get into that car with. Click. The message cut off. I gripped the phone, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Melanie. Melanie was there. I confronted her that night. She was in the kitchen, staring blankly at a glass of water, when I threw the phone onto the table. Her face went white. Play it. My voice was cold, unfamiliar. She hesitated, then pressed play. The voicemail filled the room, and when it ended, I saw it. The way her shoulders slumped, the way her breath hitched. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't confused. She already knew. I stepped forward. You were there. Her hands trembled. Mom, you were there. Tears filled her eyes. I didn't. Didn't what? I snapped. Didn't tell me? Didn't warn her? Didn't stop it? She broke. The sobs racked her body as she collapsed into a chair. I stood there, frozen, waiting. And then she said it. The words that would change everything. It was Jason. The world tilted. Jason. Jason had been driving the car. I sat down slowly. Tell me everything. Melanie wiped her face, her hands still trembling. He called me that night. Said he wanted to talk. I didn't think much of it. He picked me up and we drove around. She swallowed hard. And then we saw her. Silence. I couldn't breathe. He didn't mean to, she whispered. It was dark. He was distracted. He didn't see her in time. My stomach churned. And he just, what? Left. She let out a broken laugh. He freaked out. Said if we went to the police, he'd lose everything. That no one would believe it was an accident. And her voice cracked. I was scared. I was so scared, Mom. Tears blurred my vision. So you said nothing. She nodded. I stood up. I turned. I walked away. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. Jason thought he had one. He thought no one would find out. That Melanie would stay quiet. That I'd never put the pieces together. He was wrong. And I was going to make sure he paid.